week of the Bevan series. Virginia Butler coming to talk to us today. I'm going to hand over to Simon Step, but before I do that, please turn us off that talk. Thank you. Cy is a professor here in SAS, and he's going to do the introduction.
Well, I'm assuming everybody's gone through that exhaustive biography on Virginia. I just wanted to say that it's a great pleasure to have her back on campus. Actually, she keeps filtering back, but came in late 70s, right, from Georgia with a degree in anthropology and got her master's and PhD here, finishing in 1990. And I first ran into Virginia early 80s, I think it was, and I was exhaustively going through a ton of midden remains from the Grecian Islands measuring fish bones, and I thought I was the only one around doing that. Virginia pops up, and lo and behold, she's doing that on salmon from the Black River, and has been doing it ever since. And I'm really looking forward to this talk. I think we'll get a lot of enjoyment out of it and a lot of interesting information. I'm hoping she's going to tell me what the significance is of the native people around Kalama eating hundreds of thousands of street spine sticklebacks, but I don't know if that's part of the sustainability study. Virginia. Thank you.
Work stickleback into it, but I'll figure out something here. Can everybody hear me? Okay, is that good? First of all, I want to thank the Bevan organization for inviting me to come. It's been a tremendous opportunity just today, meeting with students and other faculty. You know, we're all in our own little caves as we work as scholars, and it's really fun to get out every now and then and see what's going on elsewhere. So this has been incredibly enjoyable. Thank you all for coming. I know that there's so many competing things, many things we can do with our time, and I thank you for coming here. So you see the title, 2,000 Years Record of Sustainable Fisheries. I want to add a couple of little jointers. The close record that I have to really study is more like 7,000 years. You know, so it's a little bit cheating to add a few thousand, you know, a few thousand here or there. But I do have records that are that old. They just don't get brought into the close analysis. And another thing, this refers to fisheries, and most of the talk is more about salmon than other fisheries. I do bring some of the other guys in, but it is a little salmon-centric. And for that, I am sorry, because I think salmon gets a little too much talk. But here I am doing it again. Here we go. Before I get started, though, I wanted to acknowledge a few folks. Sarah Campbell is a professor at Western Washington University, and she and I have been working on this project for over 10 years, and so I feel like she's kind of on my shoulder right now, helping me, very much a collaborator. And then I've had a lot of collegial support from faculty from my home institution at Portland State, archaeologists, cultural anthropologists, Madonna Moss from the University of Oregon, who's been very helpful over the years. I put Cy here, not just because he introduced me, but he was one of the people, I don't even want to say 35 years ago, that I started talking to about these things and was inspired about approaching this. I mean, if somebody else is doing it, then you could do it too. And also, Cy got Sarah and I involved in the Salmon Resilience Conference a few years ago that really got us thinking about more of these social cultural issues. So Cy really is a very important influence here. So let's get started. We have a global fisheries crisis. Now, I feel like I'm really preaching to the choir saying that here, but it's worth beginning. You know, it's like, where do you begin? This is a recent report out of the UN FAO fisheries, which repeats what we all know. You've got declining global catches, lots of people finger pointing, trying to figure it out. The big deal is there's a strong message. The state of the world fisheries is worsening. You know, like, again, preaching to the choir. We can go to the Columbia River and the history of fisheries there and see that it's sort of a potent example of these worsening conditions. Here's a picture from the late 19th century. We could go back to the mid-19th century and know that there were over 16 million salmon that used to go up the Columbia every year. And now we're lucky if a few thousand go up. Well, besides overfishing, we've got dams, mining, agriculture, you know, just the list goes on. So it's a complex and very thorny issue that we're trying to address. Why is it worsening? What can we do about it? We've been trying to fix the problem for a long time, and we're not really getting anywhere. Jim Likatowicz wrote a book in the late 90s that outlined the history of our approach at fixing the problem, and that called attention to many issues. Here we are 13, 14 years later, we're still coming up with new plans, we're still trying to address this very wicked problem that we're not seeming to get traction on. We're really not cracking that nut. So what do? Well, I think we need new approaches. We need new ideas. We need to open the door to other insights. And given my perspective, I open the door and make us think about the ancient past, what archaeology can teach us about this, as well as anthropology in the sense of social cultural anthropology. What can we learn about ways of fishing from contemporary or historic people? And I just show you a picture of an archaeological site. This is in the foothills of the Cascades, very close to Mount Rainier. And these fish remains were collected from there in the 1980s. Very well-preserved salmon bones have a lot to tell us from the watershed of the Lewis River. This is just one tiny example of an ancient fish record from one side of the landscape. These exist all over the place. It's an untapped resource that can give us some insight into what creatures were in different parts of the world, when they were there, how well they did, all kinds of things. And I'm one of a fairly small group of people that is trying to take some of these old fish bones and put them to work, make them, use them to better understand the situations we're in today, maybe help us address some of those challenges. And so that's where we're going today. You know, how can we use these old records, as well as joining up with social cultural anthropology issues. So I'm going to be talking about some of the general concepts that I'm working with in developing this research, talk about some previous work that has done a metadata analysis of the fish and other animal records, but mainly the fish of the Pacific Northwest, of Native American fisheries, and consider the types of records that, or the factors that might contribute to long-term use, and then what can we learn from this deep time perspective, especially when we join them with these ethnographic records. It's good to start with some first principles, make sure we're on the same page. Resilience, you hear about it a lot, let's make sure we appreciate what it is. It's basically the capacity of a system to withstand these disturbances without collapse. Perturbations, that is, something can come along for a while, but it really isn't resilient unless it's been jostled, unless it's been kind of shaken up. And if it comes back and it's still coming along, then it's resilient. Sustainability is slightly different, and it's simply that something persists for some period of time. Something like a predator-prey relationship, for example. And this is it's an interesting concept. I mean, we hear sustainability all the time. I'm sure that UW, I mean, everything we do is sort of sustainable. It's, recently I had a change in the way I got knowledge of my paycheck, and they said, we're doing this for sustainability. And I'm thinking, I mean, it's like the word comes out of people's mouth no matter what. And I think, how do they know that's really sustainable? How do you know something's sustainable? Well, you have to have a time perspective. You have to be able to see whether your approach to something actually is sustainable. Does it continue into the present? One way to address this issue is to look back in time and see whether an institution, some activity, some predator-prey relationship actually has some endurance, some enduring quality. So again, I invite you to think about how archaeology and some of this history can help us really gauge sustainability in a more profound way than we might have been thinking about. Now, in approaching this issue of sustainability and resilience, we need to be thinking about some debates and tensions that exist in our approach to doing this. And these relate to the possibility of sustaining a sustainable use of what we call common pool resources. So first, what are those? Those are resources that, by their size or characteristics, are difficult to exclude others from benefiting. Things like fisheries, timber, grazing. Effectively, if I take a resource, if I fish, that reduces your ability to get the same amount of fish. Common pool resources are subtractable. And in that way, there's some tension about whether they can be maintained because of the tension that might come from multiple users of those resources. So within anthropology, there's a strong thread that's coming from what we would call optimal foraging theory, or human behavioral ecology, which suggests that these restraints in resource, that limiting someone's access to a resource is hard for a group to achieve because of this individual imperative to get the most. Natural selection is going to favor individuals that try to get, to further their take. And the suggestion is that it's very hard for small-scale societies to limit cheating, to limit freeloaders. And so there's going to be this challenge, and this individual imperative is going to dominate. And in many cases, this is suggested to lead to this so-called tragedy of the commons, where there's simply no restraint. Everybody's rushing to get the most they can at that given time. So that's one side of this debate, that it's really hard to restrain use. On the other hand, there's a lot of anthropology that shows that small-scale societies can organize themselves and provide restrictions on use. They can manage these common pool resources for sustainable resource use. So that's been shown in many cases. And a whole area of research and ongoing work with traditional and local people is under this umbrella, traditional ecological knowledge, where cultural anthropologists are spending time with indigenous people, really learning how these small-scale societies manage to restrain themselves and show cooperative behavior that maintain these resources. So there are tensions. On the one hand, it happens, we can recognize it. On the other hand, it's very difficult. How does it work? And it seems like we need to find some middle ground, and we could do some analysis to figure out what parts of these small-scale societies are working. Instead of just saying it does, in what way does it do? In what way is it helping? So we're going to go to the Pacific Northwest, the area where this research is taking place. The Northwest is a big area. We're going from southeast Alaska down to northern California. So we have this coastal range that includes quiet bays and estuaries like Elliott Bay and so forth. And then we've got outer coast areas. It's a hugely variable environment. And then we swing over to the east side, the plateau, this arid area that is very arid because of the rain shadow effect of the mountains. But what unifies these areas in terms of marine resources are the big rivers that cut through the mountains, the Fraser and the Columbia, where the salmon and indigenous fish are coming in and moving into these upland basins. And so the salmon absolutely link these two areas biologically as well as culturally, because we know that Native folks in both areas heavily use salmon as well as other resources. And just some examples of peoples in two parts of this world that were very much engaged in salmon fishing and living in this world. So in a very limited way, a little nutshell overview of lifeways in the Pacific Northwest. For the first several thousand years of human existence in our part of the world, people were fairly generalized hunters and gatherers that moved from resource to resource, seasonal camps, sort of opportunistically and with prior knowledge, taking advantage of seasonal spikes in abundance, but pretty much moving around. We don't have evidence of sedentary people building houses, investing much in architecture. We just don't see evidence for that. But after about 5,000 years ago, we see increasing evidence that people are investing in architecture, really spending a lot of time in given places, and developing many attributes of a more complex way of life, with social political hierarchies, including slavery in certain places, the heavy use of stored foods, and many markers of social ranking that sometimes were expressed by big feasting events. This is an example of one out on Tachush Island on the outer coast of Washington. And here's an example of an interior of a big plank house near Vancouver, Washington, right across from Portland. So a lot of grand things going on in our part of the world after about 5,000 years ago. And people have wondered, one of the other things that we see is evidence that populations were growing. And we can work with this idea using radiocarbon dates from archaeological sites as a proxy, as a kind of estimate, crude as it is, for population size. So we look at the x-axis, and this is time, with 10,000 years going up to the present. And then the y-axis is simply number of radiocarbon dates from that, for this region. This particular region is the southern northwest coast where we're talking. And we can see that when we go way back in time, we don't have very many dates, and we take that to mean there weren't that many people. And as we move further closer to the present, we see many more people. And an interesting decline here right at the time, a little before European contact, which people are still puzzling at. To what extent might that be Little Ice Age or something like that? The main trend here, though, is that we see an increase in human populations based on this radiocarbon dates being a proxy. So there's a demographic pulse that we see using the radiocarbon record in that way. So one of the things that archaeologists have tried to do is account for this. What's accounting for these social, political, demographic shifts? And salmon has been a very important part of that argument. And that comes from different ideas about salmon. It's being a very abundant resource. There's a lot of food in that salmon, and it can supply a lot of people just from a sheer caloric value. But people have also emphasized the technological and social ways that people would have increased the value of salmon in terms of economies of scale, where you could catch a lot of fish at one time using this very clever mass capture. You could figure out how to store it and process it using very, very organized groups of people. Really use that economies of scale to increase the value and efficiency. Also, the development of storage would have increased the food value. You know, salmon come in a peak, and unless you figure out how to store that peak of abundance, you can't take advantage of it. But if you can store it, you can basically extend its value much later in the season and have more people support it. Also issues of resolving different conflicts, with getting different resources from different places. Basically, that might have led to the development of leadership that could help organize that labor. And then social ranking might evolve with the leadership that came from organizing labor around salmon. Also, the control of food that might have been traded from group to group. That might have led to some of this social political complexity. And again, salmon might not be the only thing, but people have emphasized it because of just, it's such an obvious thing in terms of its abundance and so forth. So in a previous study that I did with Sarah, we tested some of the aspects of that work. Basically, did salmon use increase over time in concert with this demographic social changes that we're talking about? And then we turned it around. Did indigenous people sustainably use fish, or did they overuse them? There's a lot of evidence from around the world. People have been using archaeological records to look at this, that native people in different parts of the world overuse resources, that they did cause declines in the prey populations. Did that happen? It had not been investigated. And we did this study using animal bones, what we call zooarchaeology, the study of animal bones from archaeological sites, to try to see, are there changes in the use over time. Again, this region that we're looking at, taking two areas, including the south central northwest coast, the Salish Sea, out to a little site out on the outer coast of Washington, and then an area in the upper Columbia that had been thoughtfully looked at in the early 1980s. A little aside, I did want to say that we have many more archaeological sites around this region and many more fish remain sites than I'm going to talk about. But those two regions, we have the most focused work, and we wanted to have some good control over the data sets that we have. So I'm showing you simply the place on the upper Columbia where that particular sample is. And then all of these others represent dots that have samples that have been studied thoughtfully, or some that don't have very big samples. But these are all sites that have fish remains. And then some of them are quite old. There's a site on the lower Luce River, right as the mouth of the Snake River, that's over 12,000 years old. We have sites in the middle Columbia, or lower Columbia, 9,000, and then another Snake River site that's 11,000. So I just want to say that what I'm talking about is tip of the iceberg in terms of fish bones records in the Columbia Plateau. So for the records that were studied, on the coastal sample, 19 different archaeological sites that had 42 different data components. A given archaeological site can be divided up into multiple timed dated units, and when that was possible, we did that. And that provided over 160,000 fish remains including many from salmon, but also dogfish, flatfish, herring, cod, so forth, a lot of mammal bone. And then sites were just defined and assigned to either whether they were on the coast or whether they were in the river to see whether the position of the archaeological site relative to resources was going to affect the frequencies of salmon. We expected that it would. And then these Columbia Plateau sites, again, have these amounts of samples. For this, what I'm going to show you is simply about the Northwest coast, the coastal records, but I want to emphasize that there's many other charts that I could show that would show a similar pattern. This is just illustrative. So this is one of those data sets showing the frequency of salmon over time. So this x-axis is time with the present going back about 7,000 years to pick up that data point. And the y-axis is something we call the salmon index, which simply says that if there's 0, that means there's salmon index is basically a fraction that is salmon, the frequency of salmon bones over all the fish. And a value of 1 means that it's all salmon. A value of 0 means it's no salmon. And each of these data points, these triangles or squares, simply represent the frequency in a relative sense of salmon in both the coast in blue triangles and squares and, excuse me, triangles in red is the river. And there's different things that you can see here, but the main thing is that there's not a trend. That is, we tried to fit lines, we did fit lines with the coast sample and then the river sample, and there's basically no trend. Whether salmon increases or decreases, it doesn't show any pattern in that sense. The main pattern that you get out of this is that these coastal sites, the ones that are really on the coastline, tend to be much less dominated by salmon. And not surprisingly, sites that are on rivers that would have reported salmon tended to be more specialized. That's not a particularly profound accomplishment. But the main thing is there's no trend that would support either of these propositions that I mentioned earlier, that salmon use increased because people were intensifying its use, or that salmon was overused and its abundance actually was reduced over time. And so the other thing that would come out of this is that it appears that salmon use was sustainable. People were able to take it in the context of growing populations. People were able to continue to take more salmon as more people came to live on this landscape. And that was not expected given the common pattern around the world where zooarchaeologists, people like me, have found this overuse, that there's a decline in the frequency of some of these prized foods over time as people started taking more and more. And this prompted this research to figure out why this is. And I want to say that, first of all, this social ecological system between salmon and people, it was resilient because there was a lot of environmental shifts and perturbations, disturbances over time. So we want to be clear about that. It's not just that there was nothing changing in the environment, so people were just coming along with it. It was really pretty dynamic and fluctuating. And this is simply a graph that shows one important thing that was playing out over the last several thousand years, Pleistocene sea level rise. As our continental glaciers were melting, after 20,000 years ago, more water was going in the ocean and sea levels were rising. And if we look at the y-axis, this is meters below sea level, and x-axis is time. And so we're really only concerned after you get to 10,000, 7,000 years ago. Still, sea level was 20 meters, 18 meters below its current level. It didn't start to approach the modern era of sea level until about 2,000 years ago. And so in the context of estuary, deltas forming, all the things associated with salmon entering a freshwater system, there was a lot of environmental changes that salmon were adjusting to in the context of sea level rise. We also know there was volcanism. We saw St. Helens blow up a few decades ago. Other volcanoes have been going off in the past few millennia, so that would have had a potential impact on fish. And we know that floods happen at high regularity across the Pacific in different senses, in the big rivers, on the little rivers. And these floods were carrying an incredible amount of woody debris that had the possibility of damming up rivers for some periods of time and really having an impact on fish. So we know that it was a very environmentally challenging environment, and yet salmon managed to get through that. So how did they do it? Well, biology must have been a factor. We know from lots and lots of genetic work that salmon are incredibly variable in their, within population, much variation in genetics that obviously has given them some of this resilience, this ability to deal with whatever comes at them. Some of that relates to life history in terms of the age and size of smolts as they leave fresh water. But it's so much bigger than that. And so we know that biology must have had a factor in this. But we don't think it's sufficient. And certainly, if we want to move forward and think about salmon and the challenges it faces today, we've thrown the book at them, in terms of environmental, kind of anthropogenic perturbations. And they're reaching the end of their genetic limit to this resilience. So maybe we need to be looking at some other issues. So here I want to talk for a few minutes about the social cultural factors that might be contributing to this long-term use, particularly the possibility that human population size and harvesting pressure was an issue, the issue of possibility of flexible resource use, and then the social institutions, how much they might have contributed to this long-term use. So one of the things that a lot of the people suggest when I talk to them about this is that, well, of course salmon were sustainably used. There weren't that many people, and they weren't taking very many fish. Well, the Pacific Northwest was one of the most populous parts of the continent before European contact. There were a lot of people that lived here. And more importantly, there was a high per capita use of salmon. And that comes out of a lot of the historic documents in terms of just how much salmon were taken in by people. So if you look at that per capita use, and some people have played with those numbers, it really does start to look about like what the late 19th century offtake of salmon harvesting was with the Euro-American entry into this place. So that's probably not the reason. And some people suggest that the capture technology wasn't sufficient to do it. Well, actually, it should probably be turned around. The technology was extraordinarily effective. In fact, these are some pictures of some of the technology that we know about in historic times. This is down in the, I can't remember the river, Auburn. It's near Auburn, the river system. But this is a river from a fish weir, a trap that we have records for from the early 20th century. Here's some pictures of reef netting out near the Lumley Reservation up near Bellingham. And here's an archaeological sample of a big weir out in Grace Harbor. That is part of an acre by acre, huge catchment system that was dates to over 1,000 years ago. If anything, this capture system would have been too effective. And Euro-Americans actually borrowed ideas from the indigenous about how to catch fish, but they amped it up to the point where it was so effective it had to be outlawed. So I think the technology could have been very effective. And apparently it was not what helped save the salmon. So it's not the cause of the resilience. Other people have talked about, and Sarah and I have considered this idea of resource flexibility, that it wasn't just about the salmon that kept these social, cultural systems going. The diet was quite broad. Here's a table of the coastal archaeological assemblages that shows the main taxa that were found: salmon, flatfish, down to rockfish, greenling. And then this is a representation or a listing of the relative frequency, whether a fish was in an archaeological assemblage. So in this case, the ubiquity. Salmon were in every single archaeological assemblage. Salmon remains were found in all of them. But other fish were found in almost all of them. That is, flatfish were found in 34 of the assemblages. Sculpins were found in 34 assemblages. Greenling were found in 12 of the assemblages. These fish were used, and we see records for them across all of these assemblages. So people's diet was extremely broad. And in terms of how important different fish were in different settings, yes, salmon was the most highly abundant. That is, 20 of these archaeological assemblages, salmon was ranked first. It was the most abundant of the fish. But these are kind of washed out in here, but flatfish, 7 archaeological assemblages have flatfish ranked first. 2 of them have sculpins ranked first. Even one of them has surf perch ranked first. You know, these fish that we never think about being, you know, big subsistence foods and important foods. So there was lots of fish that were part of the food webs and part of people's diet. Our work absolutely shows that there was a flexibility that probably contributed. As salmon might have been less abundant or another fish might have been less abundant, people could switch their diet and kind of trade back and forth. We think that was an issue, but we really don't think that was sufficient to account for this long-term pattern. And so that's why we go to these social factors I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about. So this understanding comes from studying ethnographic, historic records of Native Americans' connections with fish and the types of methods that they used to catch them and take care of them and so forth. And many people have emphasized that the social institutions and the capture methods, all of that springs from this worldview that suggests resources were personified. Resources were people. Resources were people too. You know, fish were people too. Trees were. Rocks were. You know, everything out there had personhood. And I love this quote from Butler, who's a famous anthropologist, a UW professor, who did spend a lot of time in the Salish Sea talking with folks. And I just have to read this. It's almost like a poem. And this is a quote that she got that illustrates this kind of personification of fish, how people thought about the fish that were coming up that were about to be caught. Swimmer, I thank you because I am still alive at this season when you come back to our good place. For the reason why you come is that we may play together with my fishing tackle, swimmer. Now go home and tell your friends that you had good luck on account of your coming here, and that they shall come with their wealth bringer, and that I may get some of your wealth, swimmer. Also take away my sickness, friend, supernatural one, swimmer. You know, that is it's emblematic of the language that was expressed, that we have lots of records for up and down the Pacific coast that show these deep links. And this personified resource plays out in the way people are capturing fish, processing them, and so forth, and call into this restraint on harvest. Basically, that kind of view helped set limits on when fishing started, when it stopped. It prescribed different kinds of escapement, how many go through, how many days they don't go through. And that definitely would have benefited the fish and upriver people that were wanting to get some of those fish too. Some of the constraints also were reflected in the access to gear, different types of gear, the sites, the place where people fishing, and so forth. Here's a picture of a first salmon ceremony from the Lummi, which is up near Seattle, the Lummi Reservation area, which shows the kind of ritual associated with first salmon, the capture of the first salmon, which was imbued with a tremendous amount of ceremony and this speaking of the salmon, a lot of direct connection in the sense of personified resource. And again, this first salmon ceremony, we see evidence for in Northern California, we see evidence for it in Southeast Alaska. So we can look at the communal methods of fisheries and also see the complexity of the restraints on harvest and how much it links up with this cooperative use that I was talking about way earlier. Basically, the construction of some of these weirs were, in some cases, involved high labor input. Hundreds of people sometimes were involved in the operation with very ritualized activities. A leader would be, the salmon chief would say, you go off and come back in a week with such and such number of logs. Lots of strong direction and all that, very well-defined roles. And then lots of on-site processing and harvesting, and lots of ritual associated with all of that activity. It wasn't just a routine operation. There would be prayers and lots of discussion in a ritualized fashion attached to all that, which really kept it, in a sense, the systemized knowledge was maintained through the context of a lot of that ritual. And this idea of monitoring was very much built into this communal use. And effectively, the monitoring and this establishment of incentives and disincentives to cheat were very much a part of what we can see from this ethnographic record. In terms of the carrots, what people gained, they were getting a payoff in terms of harvest. If you participated, if you played fair, you got a share. And you participated if you participated, you got your return. There was lots of ability to monitor. Here's a lot of illustrations from Hillary Stewart's fishing book. They're beautiful illustrations, mainly relative to more North Pacific, but we could think that some of these things were happening around here. So we've got people that are simply hanging out, watching this fishing activity. If there had been somebody, trying to put a few more in their bag, they would have told on somebody. And there would have been this issue of non-cooperators were punished. They didn't get, they got a reduced share, and in some cases they were banished. So there was a lot of disincentives to cheat, to take more than your share. And again, a lot of public ceremonies absolutely reminded people of all these obligations and all the things that you were just supposed to do when you set about your fishing activities. So do these behaviors or institutions, do we know they contribute to resilience? Well, we don't know. This is an argument by reasoning and just trying to persuade you of something. One of the things that we can do is say that a lot of these practices were very common up and down the Pacific, from Northern California to Southeast Alaska. The fact that they were so consistently present in so many consistent forms suggests they were effective. And in these rituals, there's a lot of different cultures and linguistic groups that exist from Northern California to Southeast Alaska. These were not one grand cultural tradition that got together every year and shared ideas. These arose independently in different places. And the suggestion would be because there were social pressures or something akin to natural selection favoring cultural activities that performed in that way. And they might have been reinforced because they actually functioned to maintain and regulate the fishery. Now, there were other things that these activities had implications for in terms of social political hierarchies, and it might have contributed to inequalities that we talked about in terms of social hierarchies. They probably played in that direction too. But certainly the possibility is there that these contributed to this long-term use. Now, there's future work that Sarah and I are doing kind of around the edges of various other projects that we're working on that's trying to track the evolution of what we see as these cooperative systems in the Pacific Northwest. It's a very challenging task because it's not a matter of simply getting radiocarbon dates and mapping the distribution of these fish weirs. Because the presence of a fish weir, a trap, simply means that people knew how to catch fish. It could be that that trap was used to catch too many fish. There's an implication. Sometimes in the literature, the link is immediately made that the presence of a weir reflects management as though it's for the conservation of a resource. And it doesn't take too much looking at the effectiveness of this gear to suggest it can play two ways. So it's more than that. It's looking at different aspects of resource use within a community. I've got a student now looking at the fish remains from a large plank house in the lower Columbia, looking at whether there's differences in the different household units that are linked to different social hierarchies. And we're trying to use the possible differences as we're coming to see them as possible links to resource areas that people in those social units had access to. We're still working out a lot of bugs with this, but there's possible ways. There's been a lot of research in the Pacific Northwest that has used spatial distributions of different fish types and butchering units to suggest how these animals were being traded and socially used within a community. So we're going to be exploring that. But I want to emphasize that it's challenging. It's not a matter of just playing with some numbers and having an example of it. There's a lot of challenging reasoning going on to develop that. But where else can we go with this? Well, we think that there are very important contemporary management implications. And one is that we need salmon, as well as all these other resources, to be a part of our urban experience. Most of the people in the Pacific Northwest live in urban environments, and we don't spend enough money bringing fish back in our urban environments. And I think it's because, it's not that it doesn't happen. I mean, we've got good examples in Portland. I know they exist in Seattle and other communities. But we often think that the habitats in cities are so degraded. You know, it's such a challenge to try to bring fish back in those areas. It's almost not worth it from a cost-benefit standpoint in terms of bringing a certain population back. But there's reasons to do it, and it's because we need more fish where people live, so that people can start to reconnect with these fish in the same sense that native peoples had much stronger links to these resources. So there's as much a social reason for bringing these fish back to these urban environments as there is a biological one. You could make the biological argument too, because we know that fish were in all of these areas. By bringing them back in these urban settings, we're simply increasing more of that genetic variability. Not that they're having to learn about and cope with the particular aspects of these urban environments from a biological point of view. It simply creates more habitats, more diversity in the places that we want salmon to inhabit once again, contributing to some of the genetic diversity in these resources. So we need to do that. But what else might we do? Well, I think that we need to invest in institutions and activities that connect people to fish and the broader food web. I think that we tend to put these kind of activities at the side, and NGOs and different entities kind of pick this up. But we don't take this on as this is part of what we should be doing and investing in as a nation, as smaller, more local governments. It's investing in some of these ritual activities that would start to look like more of what the ceremony and activities, these ritualized activities were, akin to what was going on with Native Americans. And again, this would be linked to, if there were more salmon where people lived and worked, there would be possibility of more ritual and connections to that. I didn't mention this in the other case, but if there were more fish in these urban settings, there would be the opportunity for more monitoring in the sense of citizen science that I know is a part of what is trying to play out across our management world, but it tends to be down the list of what we think is a high priority. And I would just suggest that we elevate that, given that it's these social, these human fish relationships that we have to be encouraging. And we're really approaching this too much at that top-down level. And I realized, when I was putting this talk together, that I had never addressed the question, should people eat fish? And that's the theme of this Bevan conference. And, I have to say that absolutely we should be eating fish. I mean, obviously there's exceptions because some of our fisheries are really imperiled and we need to give them a rest. But kind of back to this idea that we need to connect people with resources. People need to eat the resources. They need to get to know them and become familiar with them so that they start to care about them again. They can't just be icons on billboards. We have to form these connections. And eating fish is certainly one way to do it. And I send this out very broadly. From the archaeological record, we know that people, native peoples, were eating all kinds of fish that most people that live in the Pacific Northwest have never even heard of. So I start to think, we're pretty creative with our food. We could be getting stickleback. We could be getting snowfin. We could be getting dogfish, ratfish, all these resources out there. And inviting them into our homes, into our markets, so that people start to realize they're out there too. Because we put way too much into a few key things, and we've approached these issues way too much from the top down. So there you have it. Thanks.
There's time for a few questions before we adjourn for beer and wine outside.
Okay, I saw this guy go first.
Coincidentally, just last week I wrote in a weekly blog that focused mostly on fisheries issues. And the title of my blog was, Does It Take a Dictator to Manage a Fishery? And my focus was actually looking at traditional management systems, including Northern California salmon fisheries. And so I'd love to hear you comment about that. You ended having talked about this whole system that that promotes authoritarian control over systems, that you could have potentially a few people that provided the pressure that avoided the tragedy of the commons, as an economist would look at it, but yet that you ended with this very sort of, feel-good public, grassroots sort of perspective. So yeah, I'd love to hear your comments.
One of the things that I think that sometimes I hear that we need to go the traditional way and then it'll all be okay. Let's do the traditional, whatever was going on in the indigenous land, it works, so we need to do that. I think we have to appreciate that there's tension in that, because if we simply think it's going to work, if we apply these methods without understanding the broader fabric in which they're operating, then we're not going to make any difference. We have to appreciate that we have to have some control over cheating and so forth. I guess the context of this local stuff that I'm talking about, especially in the context of salmon, I think that the offtake, that is in urban environments, we're probably not going to do a lot of fishing for salmon in that area. So it's because of their current state, it's down the road that these fish are going to be in strong enough condition as populations for us to be harvesting them. It's more at this point kind of a celebration that they're even in our streams. I mean, Johnson Creek down in Portland, I think they had like 3 show up a couple of years ago. We're ways from going out and catching them. Though it's true that people could decide to go out and take them. I mean, as a vandal might. And having people, active citizens that are monitoring even that kind of activity would be a good thing. So I think that, kind of back to that authoritarian, I think that one of the things that you see from this indigenous traditional literature is not that it was top down. There was a general understanding of it. There were hierarchies, but there was a mutual respect about those. It's hard to say what the slave or the lower echelon individual really thought of that. These inequalities that existed in the Pacific Northwest were real. And people have talked about some of these cooperative arrangements were not egalitarian. And you have to think about how did that work, and how, I can't go into any more than that, other than it wouldn't be top down in the sense of what we have. There's definitely more local management than what we have, but it isn't everybody holds hands and walks down to the river and it all works out.
I thought it was especially interesting that you mentioned the economies of scale, where records show that the catch increased along with, I guess, technological advances. I was wondering what your thoughts are on the more current exponential rate of both human population and technological advances.
Now I'm just kind of bringing out my BS hat,
Yeah,
because
go
it's
ahead.
not, I guess that it's really almost beyond what I have knowledge of in terms of some of these ocean level fisheries. Clearly, we are using the economies of scale, to sweep up all the resources inside these, mile-wide nets and so forth that are having disastrous consequences. So those economies of scale, in terms of scaling that boat size, net size, that's having disastrous consequences because we're not really looking at what the impacts are. I mean, maybe people are. Maybe in this room people are looking at that. But I'd say that most people would suggest that level of economy of scale is leading to disastrous consequences. That's probably contributing to these worsening conditions. So economies of scale, they play out at very different scales. And in the context of these more ancient fisheries, it was economies of scale that might have led to a few more children being in the family group, or populations growing sort of gradually over time, maintaining that size in relation to what could be born with the resources around it. At least that's what the records say, that there wasn't a lot of crashing and burning in terms of overusing resources. But economy of scale, I would say that has so many meanings depending on, is it an industrial scale or a real small scale society level? I don't know if that addressed, but I can talk to you later.
You listed the various constraints imposed to limit fishing and thereby ensure it was sustainable. And I wondered, did they perceive, in fact, 500 years ago, that they could overfish, or instead was the system used to implement the kind of social structure once they became more sedentary and to promote the ritualistic celebrations rather than fear they could overharvest.
No, that's this interesting thing. It's kind of the chicken and the egg. You don't actually know what's driving it. You know, you're kind of on a circle there. One idea that I was flashing on when I was listening to your question was there has been, not so much that I can recall from the Northwest, but for other areas where indigenous fisheries, people have perceived that there was a decline or there was a drop-off in the fishery. And even if that had been environmentally induced, they recognize it as, we don't have as many fish here. So people might respond by letting greater escape, more fish go through. And that would have the added benefit of there being a stronger fishery the next time, you know, because more adults would get to the spawning area and more young could get out. So people might be responding to effects like reduced salmon, even though they weren't responsible for them, but they would recognize that because they were their brother and sister, they needed to do something about it. And they didn't know what was going on in the ocean, you know, in terms of changing salmon abundance, but there could have been a cultural response to that. But then you're right that a lot of these rituals could take on a life of their own. They could be linked to all kinds of things, like who do you marry and what season in which you build your house. And, you know, so cooperation related to fishery was probably linked to a much greater web of social, political things. And it's not sure, you know, what is the function of this. It's hard to pull it out and just speak of it individually.
Thinking about some of these really large rivers, they're going to pass through many different ethnic groups, and I'm wondering if there's any evidence for conflict between people living in headwaters versus people living on the coast for access to the sound.
This is a question that is a very important one. You know, it's basically, if you think about the Columbia River and the Fraser River, these mighty river systems, that you have many linguistic groups within the Columbia Basin, which I'm more familiar with. There'd be people at the headwaters that had no idea what was going on in the lower river. I mean, there would be perhaps some oral tradition about people that live in another place, but not the kind of cooperative arrangements where the people at the lower river would say, oh, we gotta let a few more go in because we got folks way up there. I mean, the fact is, a lot of this study about cooperative arrangements is on these river systems that are much shorter. So basically, we've got the west side of the Cascades. We can go down to the Oregon coastal rivers, down to Northern California. The Klamath is an exception. And the Klamath is one where it's a big river, and it had a long way to go, where there's a lot of evidence for ritual and careful escapement and really counting off how many fish. It isn't as clear to me how you could get a cooperative system across so many different social groups, given that, unless there was some other tie that was really linking people. Because we also know historically there were tensions across some of these groups. People were very territorial. So to what extent, how was that negotiated in terms of letting salmon go through? And that's something that I've kind of set aside here, and I didn't mention that these big rivers present different problems about the scale of the system, the social unit that is engaging in some cooperative interaction. You can sort of see it in a river system that's 100 miles long, where you know the social groups up there, and you probably have marriage partners. You probably have feastings or meetings that gather with that. That wasn't happening across the whole Columbia. Though there were areas of big meetings, you know, like the Dalles and up in Kettle Falls and other rapids, where there were people coming together. There's things that have to be thought about with these big river systems.
Yeah, I mean, the question I have, I'm thinking contemporary fisheries management, where in general, we move into a fishery system where you are a fisherman for one species of group of fish. What I'm trying to, the question I would like to know is if, say, salmon declines by 90% in a particular year, without the ability to find something to substitute for salmon, it's hard to see me as a representative of the human race saying, wow, I'm going to starve this year because Daniel's further up the river. Surely they must have had enough alternatives to be able to to be able to substitute. And I guess how we take that story and bring it into where we are today, because we sort of set up systems that don't allow fishers to be able to substitute. Is that a fair comment?
I think that is a fair statement. You know, we're very specialized, it's very targeted fisheries. I would say that it's a question that I want to look at a finer scale in terms of the substitution and this flexibility that we have some records for, and what does that really look like. One of the ways that we could get at it in terms of how a group is really responding to possible crashes, like only 90, or say you lose, we don't have very many salmon. So we basically have to have much finer resolved occupation series of or archaeological records to know within that time frame where the environmental problems are. To recognize a problem like that, it would have to be ongoing, you know, for decades, because a lot of our time units are several hundred years in duration. So we have troubles looking at, I mean, I'm not copying out, but you can't get at that scale right now with the way that we go about dating. But another thing that we've looked at and talked about, and many other people have, is that there were systems of trade, and I was talking with Derek about this earlier, that there was ways that people socially engaged in broader networks to backfill resource deficits, so that what happened at your place in the landscape might be a problem for your group. But there were trade networks as well as big potlatches, which were absolutely part of the ritual, where people had the good runs here, lots of food here, bad runs there. This high, well-endowed group would have a giant ritual gathering feast, and everyone would come and be able to partake of that abundance. And it wasn't just like giveaway, I'm sharing, I'm very noble in doing that. The feast poster got a tremendous amount of status from that, and that kind of boosted that profile, contributing to some of that social hierarchy that we know exists in this area. So a complex kind of trade would have offset some of that, like contributing to some of that flexibility, so that it wasn't each community out for themselves even. Sometimes there were regional networks of support. I'm not getting to your issue of the problems with specialized fisheries, other than I do think that we focus too much on a few key species in our recovery efforts, and we haven't considered the broad palette of not only other fish foods, but just the whole food webs that these fish need to be supported by. And we haven't communicated to the public that it's really about the food web. You hear us talk about salmon all the time, but we really do care about all those other ones too. But the fact that we don't talk about all those other ones very much, it's not surprising that they don't think about them. So they become specialized in their understanding of what we need to take care of.
How well did the local people know the life cycle of the salmon? I mean, was it just that the ocean supplied this magical fish that came from nowhere and appeared, and what we caught, Did they understand the smolts going down, those little skinny fish that look so silly?
No, I haven't done enough investigating on that level of traditional knowledge. I do think that in certain areas, and there's some discussion of this, there's a paper coming out soon about it, that Native Americans knew what eggs were. They knew that the globular, shiny things that were deposited were eggs, because there's some evidence that they were actually transplanted, that they got picked up and moved from one stream to another in the hope of maybe a dam or something, in terms of a log jam or something might have blocked the stream, and they were trying to encourage the re-entry, recovery of a salmon population in the area. There's also a lot of evidence of, many people talk about different landslides that have occurred on rivers, and Native peoples picking up the fish and moving them on the other side of the landslide. So there's clearly an idea that they needed to get somewhere.
One more question?
So, one of the differences between today and then is we can see if the wild population can recover on its own. So my question has to do with, have you discovered in the past situations where the native people had to deal with issues where runs were failing, and they had to make decisions that resulted in, that impacted harvest and impacted the way that they related to how we going to do this?
Well, I think that I'm not picking up the specific example, but there are examples that relate to, in a sense, I was referring to if there was a climate change or something that created a real low in salmon productivity and not as many came up, that people would have let more go that year, really drop down their harvest. In a similar way, I think that, I don't know specific examples of that one, but if the numbers were really low, they would realize that there was an issue. And again, that's my brother, that's my sister. I've got to do what I can to make sure that this, the family maintains itself. So I don't have a specific example that would be consistent with hatcheries. I thought you might be going with this issue of there's a lot of difference between Native Americans, in some cases, appreciation of hatcheries. And kind of,
I understand that.
right, right. Well, it is one of those things that I hear, challenges of, like traditional knowledge. How does that get worked in? And I think that where we are today is such a complex mix of all kinds of stuff that it's hard to go back in time with some of those very strong feelings about it.
It sounds like what you're saying is that in times of scarcity, they self-impose restrictions to compensate for that and
Right.
allow the resources to recover.
Right, but I think the key thing is to the indigenous, it wasn't that they might have been responsible for that scarcity, though they might have claimed it. It didn't really matter. It needed to be addressed.
Well, thank you very much.